I decided for my talk today to take up the claim of the conference organizers that there's a palpable shift from a horizontal to a vertical orientation within contemporary land-engaged art. I decided to take that as a provocation and an opportunity to think through that idea further and to also push myself to delve into some new work, namely this book on contemporary art and geological imaginaries. So I'm presenting really new, not totally polished work today, and for that reason I'm particularly curious for your inputs. So I hope we can talk about it either one-on-one or in the discussion later this afternoon. Okay, so I want to open by just giving a few thoughts on this reorientation toward the vertical, both in land-engaged art, but I think also much more broadly in spatial thinking and theory. And some of the reasons that I think it is occurring and that others would argue that it's occurring, and maybe also some of the potentials of a more vertical orientation to thinking about geography or space. So I think one of the most obvious kind of reasons that perhaps we're starting to pay more attention to the vertical, including artists, is climate change itself, which is a phenomenon that entails multiple layers and links the geological and the atmospheric. So carbon deposits deep underground are extracted, processed, burned, and released into the atmosphere at such concentrations that they're spurring all sorts of kind of transformative and catastrophic events. The image you see here is a still from a video diptych by a wonderful Swiss artist, Ursula Biemann, a video essayist. She did a piece in 2013 called Deep Weather, which I thought also is a really wonderful title. And the piece Deep Weather juxtaposes these vast landscapes in the Canadian tar sands, where this very dirty form of extraction is taking place, with the coastline of Bangladesh. Not in a totally deterministic way, but it sort of sets up this loose association between two very seemingly distant geographies, where one place across the world is sort of battling now rising sea levels. So it's a piece that kind of brings the vertical and the horizontal together, you could say. And I do think it's fair to say that as climate change becomes more and more on the public's radar, that there's a growing just kind of awareness of Earth systems in general and Earth system science, kind of in contemporary culture. I think we could likewise point to the very influential concept of the Anthropocene, which not at all surprisingly has come up a couple of times already today. We probably have a range of opinions about that term, but I think it's safe to say that it's had a profound effect within the arts and humanities in the last several years. And the term itself, of course, is a play on the geologic. It's, making the claim that within this stratigraphy of the Earth, that the humans have left enough of a mark that we've entered a new geologic age. So the term itself kind of exerts a geologic kind of frame, and I think therefore kind of spurs a vertical orientation. I heard a talk recently by the historian Gabriele Hecht, who described the Anthropocene as a charismatic mega-concept, which I really loved. Kind of a play on the idea of a charismatic megafauna, and she's absolutely right. So the International Geosphere and Biosphere Program in 2015 claimed that one way we could mark the Anthropocene, and of course there are so many people weighing in now about the starting date, and but one of the kind of metrics or markers you could say is the massive rearrangement of earthly materials, so from rocks all the way down to molecules. So this biosphere program in 2015 claimed that we move more sediment and rock annually now than natural processes. So that might be one kind of indicator that we live in an Anthropocenic moment. The theme of the Anthropocene, or the concept, the idea, which has become a kind of theoretical force, is itself connected to a whole set of lively debates within arts and academia that are along the lines of new materialism or animal studies, multi-species turn, non-human studies. So there's a lot sort of happening that's relative or related to, I think, these broad topics of environment and ecology, and it becoming more linked to kind of social theory. Within the arts, I think, this geologic turn is somewhat perceptible, and it's maybe sibling turn would be an archaeological turn. Steve Rowell mentioned earlier this exhibition at the MCA in Chicago that was curated by Dieter Rollerstette, if I'm saying his name correctly, I think not. In 2013, Steve had a piece in the show. So this curator also kind of made the claim of this pervasive turn towards the archaeological in contemporary art. And I just brought in this one funny image by an artist in the show because Smithson will come back later in my talk by Tony Tassett. It's called Robert Smithson, Las Vegas, 1995. And of course, it's a riff on, it's a reperformance of these now iconic photographs of Smithson out on Jean Dry Lake bed outside of Las Vegas, helping Heitzer carve or dig out Rift, the first of his 9 Nevada depressions, with Nancy Holt behind the camera. Along with an opening onto deep time, I think the Anthropocene signals a shift, or we might think of it also signaling or precipitating a shift from thinking in terms of a global frame to a planetary frame. And this kind of category or scale of the planetary is more and more detectable, I think, in contemporary art, but also in contemporary writing. And we might think about this in terms of the predominance of a global frame being tied to theories of globalization, which have been so dominant, particularly maybe in the last several decades in this moment of late capitalism, where many people, geographers and others, have written about kind of the way that the world has been transformed by late capitalism by way of also intensifying telecommunication networks and international trade, this moment of kind of great acceleration from mid-20th century forward, that we might think of it in terms of kind of a tightly interconnected set of networks that span the surface. So it's a very human kind of horizontal, in a way, perspective relative to the planetary, which I think automatically kind of brings Earth systems, physical and natural world kind of into the purview. And so I think that also is kind of represents maybe a shift from the horizontal to the vertical. The artist and self-proclaimed experimental geographer Trevor Paglen, with whom I'm sure some of you are already well familiar, wrote a piece in eFlux in 2016 called Some Sketches on Vertical Geographies, and I'm going to quote him a little bit at length. He sort of underscores the same point about a kind of reorientation, or the need for an orientation away from the horizontal towards the vertical. So this is Paglen's words. Quote, "I've long thought that conventional understandings of geography were a little too horizontal, that geographical concepts such as production, uneven development, territory scale, geopolitics, and the like tended to be theorized on an assumed horizontal plane of human existence. That makes sense, because the vast majority of human activity does more or less conform to a relatively narrow vertical band on the Earth's surface that can support human life. But human infrastructures and activities also inhabit a vertical axis, from deep-sea mining and undersea cables, which you see here in one of his photographs, to outer space, or even interstellar space. As others have observed, different topologies of development, politics, urbanism, and the production of space emerge when we begin to consider the vertical dimensions of human world-making," unquote. And this is an image of space junk, or satellites, both live and kind of defunct satellites orbiting the Earth. And I believe it was in the book Making the Geologic Now, Trevor Paglen made this wonderful suggestion that we should think of this space junk orbiting the Earth as the most recent sedimentary layer of the Earth, that it's sort of part of our stratigraphy. So others, including geographers, and I'll just mention really briefly the work of A.L. Weitzman, the architectural theorist, have also been writing about the potential of importance of taking on a more vertical orientation to how we think about space and politics. And one reason being that we need to take the geological or earthly matter more seriously into our consideration. So how do we develop a politics that's not only a human politics, but a human and earth politics? Or how do we put the geo back in geopolitics so it's not so kind of exclusively anthropocentric and human, but takes matter very seriously? I'm sure many of you are also familiar with the work of A.L. Weitzman, who has argued that, quote, geopolitics is a flattening discourse that largely ignores the vertical dimension, preferring to look across landscape rather than cut through it, unquote. So he's done work on what he calls the politics of verticality. And without going into detail about this very elaborate research project that he and others are part of called forensic architecture, I just wanted to mention, some of you may have seen this as well, that just last week in the New York Times, there was an article on the front page, a multimedia article, which they had collaborated with forensic architecture, this group of researchers largely based at Goldsmiths, that was basically building a case through very careful analysis of images of building site that proved that that a chlorine bomb had been dropped on an apartment building in Douma near Damascus in Syria in early April of this year. So this was very vehemently denied by Assad's government, but forensic architecture, along with other kind of experts, were able to piece together a kind of very detailed analysis of this crime scene and prove that the bombs were dropped from the air onto the building and perforated the building, and they did this very kind of elaborate forensic reconstruction. So that would be an example of a kind of a way that spatial analysis is addressing what Wiseman would call volumetric violence. So, moving on. So my focus or interest today on the subsurface and the underground, I'm interested in ways that vertical geographies are being newly and intensively financialized. So, I mean, vertical geographies have been financialized for a long time with mining and other kind of industries, but I think it's safe to say that it's penetrating into deeper layers and to more distant reaches right now, and so this rampant privatization of the underground is something I wanted to bring into our conversations here. So we could certainly think about fracking, which is a very strange form of extraction, not only because it's very dispersed horizontally, also vertically, but we don't see the vertical as well, but its infiltration into kind of residential regions, even in front and backyards of people's homes in the United States is quite extraordinary. The kind of earthquakes that are now occurring in places that hadn't previously had earthquakes because of destabilizations underground. New forms of what we could call extreme extraction. So there are a whole kind of group of what we could call more extreme forms of extraction or extreme extraction with all sorts of uneven impacts, from displacement to dispossession, contamination, extinction that come along with these extreme forms of extraction. But one example, which I learned about recently at a talk by the geographer Bruce Braun, is tight oil, which is a form of extraction that's highly dangerous. It's very precarious for the laborers. It's very high mortality rates among the workers. But it involves going down vertically and then moving horizontally across a kind of a layer to basically squeeze oil out of almost solid rock. So it's a very intensive form of extraction, a very dangerous form of extraction that implicates the horizontal and the vertical. It kind of moves through. This isn't underground on Earth, but I couldn't help but bring in this example. A friend of mine in Zurich, Rory Rowan, who's a political geographer, is researching space mining and the degree to which contemporary governance of outer space is being shaped around the commercial sector. So the potential of mining rare earth and other minerals from asteroids, etc. So that's a pretty crazy, starts to feel very sci-fi realm that he's researching. We could also look to what are called iceberg basements that are proliferating in London in particular. I also learned about fairly recently. So iceberg basements are basements that are built underneath structures that are often super vast in areas with high real estate values, so you can't build up or out, so you build down and under. I think there's a sort of spatial parallel to the tight oil, this kind of lateral expansion underground out of view. So this would be a diagram of an iceberg mansion in London and an interior shot from one of them. So there's kind of, again, this intensive privatization of the underground that's sort of happening beneath our feet but out of our view. And I think it's safe to say there are sort of new destabilizations underfoot that are occurring along with this. This is a sinkhole in Guatemala. Excuse my inclusion of the spectacular image. Okay, in the time that's left, I want to move on to Lara Almarcegui's work. She is an artist. She's a Spanish artist that's who has lived for 15 or 20 years now in Netherlands. So she's been working in Holland for a very long time. She's also been working for a very long time on the underground, or the subsurface. And a lot of her work focuses on raw materials out of which architecture and the built environment are constructed. So she's very interested in architecture, and architects tend to be interested in her work, which is actually how I ended up coming to know about her work, was through architecture more than art almost. So she's had a long time fascination with the underside of cities, and apparently there's a whole breed of books of like underground New York, underground Paris, underground London, and she's obsessed with these books and has her own library of them, and really wanted one for Madrid, which is the capital of her home country. And there had never been one done, so she was commissioned to be part of a show 5 years ago, or to do, maybe it was a solo exhibition, I can't remember, 5 years ago in Madrid, and she proposed to do a book, which sold out immediately. So I've never seen the book, it's in Spanish only. But she also led a series of tours to underground Madrid. At the time, there was a deep excavation taking place, tied to the construction of an underground car park and a new rail line. And so they took people down there to observe the layers of subsoil as well as the infrastructure underground. And there was this book that kind of accompanied it, which is typical in a lot of her work. But what I'm going to talk about today, more specifically, is a new body of work that she's doing that's tied to mineral rights, which emerged, as she's explained it to me, from a shocking realization that she had in 2013. As she put it to me in a recent conversation, quote, "I was very in the surface until then," unquote. She was in Dallas, Texas, like in this petroscape that Steve kind of alluded to earlier, for an exhibition, and she learned about mineral rights tied to oil in that context, and became immediately fascinated and started doing research online to figure out who owned or had leasing rights to the underground of her city, which is Rotterdam, where she's lived for many years. And it turns out that she found out that the entire city of Rotterdam, essentially, the mineral rights to the entire underground of her city was owned by NAM, N-A-M, and when she just did a little bit more digging around or research, she found out that's Shell. So Shell Oil owns the entire underground of Rotterdam. And she said it was a real wake-up call, because she said, it made her feel incredibly stupid that she had been doing work on the underground for all of these years, and she didn't know this at all. And she started talking to city officials and also archaeologists, and she's like, nobody knew. We all know about Shell. We know the oil moves through the port of Rotterdam, which of course is one of the biggest ports in the world, but nobody realizes that Shell actually owns the ground underneath our city. So this was quite a shock to her system, and became a kind of basis for a new body of work. So the state owns the land, but it's massively, it's leasing it massively to mining companies. This is not a map of Rotterdam underground, because I don't have one, but it's a map of a table of formations in Alberta, Canada, that shows you the formations as well as who has leasing rights. So it's a kind of vertical section, like a geologic section, that also registers who has legal rights to the resources underground. And if you could imagine, it's like very complex work to understand the bureaucracy of how this all works. It's very legal-oriented research and very economic-oriented research, and has required her becoming very fluent in a lot of technicalities. But in the end, what she has done as part of her project, after realizing this degree to which the underground is being surveyed, speculated upon, apportioned, and also realizing her own and others' utter awareness of this development, she has gone about acquiring mineral rights herself, specifically of iron ore deposits underground. And she sometimes has done this on her own, and sometimes in collaboration with art institutions. In 2015, she procured mineral rights of an iron deposit. I can't pronounce the name. It's like a little place northeast of Oslo. And then she got another, shortly thereafter, iron deposit in 2 locations near Graz in Austria. In the case of her plot in Norway, and you can see her little plot is marked out here on this map, and this is the deed. And I'll just show you a handful of pictures of the land where she has this mineral right. So she has what's called exploration mineral rights for 9 years for an area that's 1 kilometer square to the middle of the earth. And the surface, interestingly, is part of a common forest, so it's public land on the surface. And she only has rights to iron, so that's how mineral rights work. It's for a specific material. In order to maintain her mineral rights, she has to perform and prove that she is actively scouting for iron. So there's this whole level of the project, which I have no images of, but I would like to get them, of her every year needing to rent equipment and go out and kind of, in a very performative way, perform the role of the speculative geologist. And then to send those images in to kind of show that she's really looking for this material. So, I mean, in terms of, there aren't a lot of images of the project, which I'll mention again at the end. Like, that's sort of it. You know, there are a couple of key things, I think, to say about this work. I mean, on a very obvious level, the work is about the invisible commodification of resources that are, in this case, invisible partially or largely because they're underfoot. So it's about making this kind of invisible legal and economic geography visible and raising our awareness and hoping to spur people to start asking more questions about it. One reason it's also invisible is a lot of the mapping techniques and technologies that are used by companies, extractive industries, are very, very technical, so people don't have really access to kind of visualizing the underground. So she's had to, the access to this knowledge is very technical, and it's forced her to collaborate with engineers and geologists, which she says, you know, gets very, very far from art. And involves a lot of bureaucracy. So she's attempted to get mineral rights in several other countries, like Germany and Spain and a couple of other countries where it just didn't work. In the end, she was denied rights. And with each country, the rules are a bit different, too, and the process a bit different. So there are a lot of challenges, I think, to how to represent visually a practice like this. I mean, for one thing, that the subject matter, the content of the work, the ground, the underground, is not only invisible, you could say, or difficult to visualize. It poses kind of great challenges to visualization, but it's almost avisible. It sort of blocks vision. And for that reason, I think it can be harder to sense or relate to or to grasp. It's like a largely kind of abiotic terrain. And she herself has been very aware of the relative dearth of interest in this project relative to some of her other projects, which I'll show you in a minute, which have had more kind of appeal to curators and collectors. So she said, you know, I realized at some point I was just digging a hole for myself as an artist because I'm doing this really bureaucratic work on something that you can't picture, and it doesn't like bring me anywhere in art. It brings her kind of far from art. What's interesting to me about the gesture, maybe most interesting, is the way that this gesture creates a void. So it takes something out of circulation, at least temporarily. It holds something in reserve, and in doing so, it draws our attention to the market itself. And by that way, it kind of indirectly visualizes this condition that we're in and which is pervasive, but of which we're largely unaware. So she withholds this potential resource of iron from commodification and circulation, and in so doing creates what we might call like a hole in the market. So I think that's quite interesting as a gesture. I think it also links on some level to certain activist practices, certainly within oil, to keep it in the ground, which are activists who say, you know, which scientists have also said we have to keep something like 80% of the oil reserves in the ground, and gas needs to stay in there if we're not going to sort of go over the tipping point. I'm not quoting that properly, but in any case, we need to keep these fossil fuels in the ground, and there are some activists that have sort of pooled resources together to kind of get leasing rights to keep it in the ground. So I think there's a parallel between her work and that work. We might even, it's a little bit less proximate, also think about the work of activist artists like connected to Liberate Tate and Not an Alternative in New York City, who have been doing very important political work with art institutions to force museums to be more self-reflexive about their own embeddedness in fossil fuel kind of economies. So groups that are asking museums to sort of kick climate change deniers off of their boards or to divest their own investments from fossil fuel industry. So it's not exactly the same, but there's some kind of relationship there, I think, especially when she asks museums to divert their funds to buy mineral rights. She's kind of instrumentalizing the institution to kind of enter into, a sort of a different system. And I think also asking then the art institution to take on a subterranean imaginary, which I think is really interesting. Now, in her case, it's not explicitly activist for sure, and one way that she, I think, kind of positions the work to make sure it's not taken that way is that she doesn't deal at all with rare earth, which she claims is too sexy. She also is like, I don't want to deal with oil because I actually am interested in materials that I can build things out of, and I can't build anything out of plastics or oil except plastics, and she doesn't like oil. So iron is her thing, it's her material. And the reason it's her material is because it is the cheapest material on the list. It's almost free. She said you can get like a ton for $120 or something like this. If I heard her correctly, it's extremely cheap. It's totally basic. It also, I think has this kind of association with the industrial age and heavy industry. So even though it's still widely used, there's this kind of poetic anachronistic quality about it. And in a way, because it's so cheap, she really wants to make sure that people don't misunderstand her gesture as paralleling that of a financial speculator, that she's hoping herself to kind of make money out of the mineral rights. So in a way, it's a kind of self-protective gesture that I think underscores that what she's doing is symbolic and not literal entirely. Like she's buying something that's not worth anything. Because the point isn't to actually get the mineral rights, it's to draw our attention to the whole structure of mineral rights. In the last few minutes, and I think I'm probably getting close. Yeah. 8 minutes. Okay, perfect. Her other work, which you're more likely to know if you know her work at all, has been on wastelands. And similar to the underground, this series of guides that she's done to wastelands kind of make the invisible visible, invisible geographies visible. So urban peripheries, like the underground, these places that are largely under our radar, are places that she's interested in. Wastelands also, if we want to use that word, it was the name of my dissertation back in the old days, so I've used that word a lot in my own writing. They're interesting. These interstitial spaces are interesting because they're sort of a rupture in the fabric of designed urban space. Also maybe a little bit like the kind of hole in the market she produces with the mineral rights. These wasteland spaces are temporarily out of circulation. They're sort of post-design and pre-design. At the same time, they're kind of in a state of limbo that has its own time. They're often sites of intensive financial speculation, but also signs of projection and possibility of kind of imagined futures, which is one reason that they have captured so much interest on the part of artists and architects over the years who've taken a real shine to them. So this is just one example of one of her wasteland guides to kind of pre-Olympic sites in London, and from her book on Ala Khan. And her most recent guidebook, which somebody luckily brought to the library and back because I forgot to bring my copy, is called The Gravel Pits of Basel. Very sexy title. I'm sure it'll be a hot seller. But I'll put it back at the library. But so this was for a piece that she just showed at Art Basel like 2 weeks ago or something. And for that project, she created a guide. I think it's 12 gravel pits around Basel, where she was looking at the extent to which, the Rhine has been a major source of gravel in Basel, which is a city that's had a lot of construction also coming out of this kind of gravel material. And so she created this guidebook of of these quarries, only one of which I think, or two, are still active, that kind of underscore the connection between the center of the city and the hinterland. And I was part of a conversation with her at Art Basel a couple of weeks ago, and this quote came back to me, which might actually very well have been on one of the Cluey tours that you mentioned today. I was on the Margins in Our Midst tour to Irwindale, and Matt Coolidge said, "For every pit there is a pile," which I love. And in her project, there are 12 pits that are documented here, and then there was a big pile in the middle of the Mesoplots. I'm sure some of you saw it. And over the course of the 5-day weekdays, she had truckloads of gravel deposited on the middle of the Mesoplots that were the equivalent amount that would be extracted on a daily basis from this one particular quarry. So I think it was 6 or 8 truckloads a day were being deposited and created this kind of growing mound of material. A lot of her work deals with kind of architecture. It's kind of what makes architecture and what architecture would sort of return to when it falls to ruin or when it's sort of post-design. And in this context, up against this star architecture of Herzog Demerol in the background and in the foreground is an installation created by Recitas Urbanas, I hope I'm saying their name right, a Spanish collective who she was, it was all part of this big project sponsored by Creative Time in New York City. And also looking the other direction, this gleaming skyscraper, the project, I think really was a kind of blunt reminder of the materiality of architecture in the city by extension, that the city is made up of stuff, and stuff has specific histories and geographies. So it kind of, again, like shifts us to another register. I'm sure many of you have been thinking about Robert Smithson as I show you her work, or he came to mind. She definitely acknowledges Gordon Matta Clark and Mirla Lederman-Euclides and Robert Smithson as kind of artists who've been very influential for her. And in the last couple minutes, I just want to say a few things about Smithson, who clearly, like her own work, is kind of in dialogue with his body of work. And as we all know, he had a great interest in geology and mineralogy and raw matter. Here, he and Virginia Dwan are collecting material at a quarry for one of his non-sites. I don't remember the exact date, probably 1968 would be my guess for that image. Of course, he was one of the first artists and the most important artists to kind of engage these peripheral interstitial sites, quarries and dumping grounds, that were kind of at the edge of the city. And in his essay, Monuments of Passaic from 1967, published in Art Forum, he profiles these ruins in reverse, as he calls them, which Jennifer Roberts, not Anne Reynolds, Jennifer Roberts, has made the point, which has corrected us that these were not ruins. In fact, this was a construction site where a new highway was being built. So it was sort of something being built, not something being destroyed, as it's often been kind of misinterpreted. But in any case, I wanted to kind of end by coming back to this kind of more canonical land art and Smithson's interest not only in wastelands, but in making in moving away from making objects to kind of shifting towards processes, so a shift from products to processes. And he writes about this, for instance, in his essay, Sedimentation of the Mind, this interest in going back to the raw and elemental, and this subtractive quality of iconic earthworks from the 60s and early 70s is one way we could think about this work, which I think Bill pointed out. It wasn't purely horizontal. It all involved digging down as well, even though it was in these vast kind of expansive deserts, which were very horizontal in their orientation. I wanted to share a quote because I think it's such an interesting take on land art, or earthworks, specifically these American earthworks, iconic earthworks, that's I think sheds a kind of different light on them. Which is a quote from Virginia Dwan, the eminent gallerist, from an interview in 1984 she did with the Archives of American Art. And she spoke in that interview retrospectively about these earthworks by Michael Heitzer and Smithson in terms of their subtractive mode, their kind of taking away. And she almost suggested that this art offered a direct critique of capitalism and of capitalist overproduction and consumption, which is not an interpretation that one hears almost ever about this work. And that she refers to elsewhere, I'll share her quote with you in a minute, as this kind of, she describes this kind of sense in the 60s that there was this over-effulgence, like this kind of nausea from too many things being produced, and that these gestures of going back to earth and raw materials and kind of digging down was in resistance to this kind of overproduction. So she says, quote, "It was like you dug a hole out of what actually existed and displaced it perhaps, but you didn't take the material, put it through a furnace, change it into something else, make another object, and put it on a pedestal. Somehow there was this sense for me of almost a nausea of objects. This was going back to the elemental and sort of saying, I'm going to work right here and with this and not alter it that much, just give it a different shape," unquote. I would also point out, however, that this work, these iconic earthworks, they had a complicated relationship to the market as well as to media. I think we can also track an entrepreneurial tendency for sure in the work of Robert Smithson at the end of his life. He made a proposal shortly before his death, which is reproduced in the Jack Flam book on Smithson's writing, where he basically makes the argument that these mining sites, these like old kind of tailing piles of mining sites, were this untapped kind of opportunity of a place and also funding for artists to work. So there was a very entrepreneurial dimension to their work too. So I don't want to overly romanticize it. And you'll hear me tonight talk about the colonial and macho aspect of it. Okay, I know I have to wrap up. Vertical horizontal orientation, to come back to it quickly. So this work from the 60s, of course, did have a horizontal orientation to some extent, but the vertical was very heavily in that work as well. Whether we think of the final scene of Spiral Jetty, the film, where Smithson's running around this spiral jetty almost like in a kind of sci-fi panic with the helicopter surveilling him from above. These artists were very much engaged with the kind of imagery coming out of Cold War politics and space exploration, these Apollo image shots from the late 60s, which were so heavily influential in public imagination at that time. Also, I've written before about the connection between atomic testing, kind of associations with the desert and the Cold War, and how that also was not irrelevant to why they were out in these dry desert lake beds in Nevada and the like, California. So the horizontal was very strongly present there as well. But I would say that in our own moment of extreme financial speculation and extraction that is reaching to greater depths and greater heights than ever before, Lara Almarcegui's body of work on mineral rights, even though, or maybe because it's not much to look at, is highly timely and evocative. Thank you.